Here, you know what? Let's you know what? Maybe it's time we read something. Let's get some reading in. Hey, how about Walter Rodney, huh? Little Walter Rodney, anyone? The Imperialist Partition of Africa, 1970, anyone? All references are to Lenin's imperialism unless otherwise noted. See, no need to segue, right? No need to say we're gonna focus. Lenin very rarely mentioned Africa in his writings on colonialism, but inferences about Africa can be drawn from imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and other works. Most bourgeois writers on the partition of Africa make snide remarks on the Leninist explanation of imperialism because they have already established a near monopoly of what is written on the subject. It is necessary to frame this analysis as a refutation of common misconceptions. Furthermore, as is so often the case with the works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, many hostile criticisms are based on sheer ignorance of the text. Thus, the reader must bear with frequent quotations. Lenin is generally said to have professed an economic theory of imperialism. This gives rise to criticism that his theory was one sided because Europeans carved up Africa for several reasons: economic, political, social, humanitarian, psychological, etc. Of course, Marxism does not concern itself solely with some so called economic aspect of society. It is a worldview which perceives the presence of multiple variants within the complexity of human society and seeks to unravel the relationship with reference to the material conditions of existence. Lenin did not have to spell out this elementary Marxist position in everything he wrote. His essay on imperialism dealt with the question of the expansion of the capitalist economy. The non economic dimensions were known to exist and were regarded as secondary. Lenin made two passing references to this point. One, the capitalists divide the world, not any particular malice, but because the degree of concentration which has been reached forces them to adopt this method in order to obtain profits. And they divide it in proportion to capital, in proportion to strength, because there cannot be any other method of division under commodity production and capitalism. But strength varies with the degree of economic and political development. In order to understand what is taking place, it is necessary to know what questions are settled by the changes in strength. The question as to whether these changes are purely economic or non economic, e.g., military, is a secondary one, which cannot in the least affect fundamental views on the latest epoch of capitalism. Two, the non economic superstructure, which grows up on the basis of finance capital, its politics, and its ideologies, stimulates the striving for colonial conquest. We do need to be informed as to how changes in the politico military balance of power and European national aspirations for domination stimulated the striving for colonies in Africa. Such factors were not outside Lenin's field of awareness, and exploiting them at length does not in the slightest invalidate his thesis. For example, such facts as that the French are hung up on prestige, or that changes take place in the so called balance of power, have to be related to the political economy of Europe. They did not arise out of thin air. They were products of the development of monopoly capitalism within the boundaries of several European nation states. The elaboration of this argument would carry us deeper into the European past, which is outside the scope of this brief analysis. The most pertinent question is, how far and in what ways did monopoly capital impinge on Africa during the period of notorious scramble? A great deal of trouble has been taken to show that little capital was invested in Africa prior to the First Worldwide Capitalist War. Western Europe invested far more in Eastern Europe, the United States, Latin America, and Asia than it did in Africa. This is a contradiction of Lenin only for those who have not read Lenin. Lenin's examples of investment by monopolies outside the capitalist epicenters are situated in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America. He cited Russia, Romania, Turkey, and Argentina most forcefully as countries on the receiving end of investment and exploitation. Only Britain, with a large number of old and new colonies, was exporting a significant proportion of its capital to its political colonies in the early part of this century. France was investing mainly in Russia, and Germany divided its interests between Eastern Europe and the Americas. Lenin quoted the geographer Suppan to the effect that the characteristic feature of the late 19th century was the division of Africa and Polynesia. He then added that Mr. Suppan's conclusion must be carried further, and we must say that the characteristic feature of this period is the final partition of the globe, not in the sense that a new partition is impossible. On the contrary, new partitions are possible and inevitable, but in the sense that the colonial policy of the capitalist countries has completed the seizure of the unoccupied territories on our planet. Lenin's emphasis on completed is significant because it places the scramble for Africa within the context of a single process emanating from Europe and spreading across the whole world. Its intensity was not the same at all points. Huge amounts of capital were not initially invested in Africa, but Africa could not escape the inexorable process of expansion, domination, and partition which had its roots in monopoly capital. Lenin took pains to show that the division of the world among capitalist monopolies and the nation states in which they were encrusted was not a policy option, which could just as well have been replaced by more enlightened thinking. He emphasized the internal logic which made international partitioning inseparable from the nature of monopoly capital in that epoch. Africa was the great unknown continent. Europeans dreamed of its great potential. Certain remarks of Lenin are particularly apt in this regard. Quote, finance capital is not only interested in the already known sources of raw materials, because present-day technical development is extremely rapid. Hence, the inevitable striving of finance capital to extend its economic territory and even its territory in general. In the same way that the trusts capitalize their property by estimating it at 2 or 3 times its value, taking into account its potential and not present returns, and the further results of monopoly, so finance capital strives to seize the largest possible amount of land of all kinds and make it in any place it can, by any means, and counting on the possibilities of finding new raw materials there, and fearing to be left behind in the infinite struggle for the last available scraps of undivided territory. End quote. It took a considerable time before imperialist powers made efforts to invest large amounts of capital in Africa as a whole. In the case of France, significant capital investment in Africa is a post-Second World War phenomenon. Lenin had noted the possibility of exporting capital to backward countries was created by those countries having been drawn previously into international capitalist intercourse, thereby creating elementary conditions, such as the start of railway and port construction, for further and more intensified investment. The necessary infrastructure was emerging in Eastern Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia, but this occurred scarcely anywhere in Africa during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Lenin, like Marx before him, recognized the tremendous contribution made by Africa to the accumulation of capital during the epoch of the slave trade. The fact that he did not deal with Africa at any length in the context of imperialism was not an oversight, for in that epoch, Africa was marginal to the development of capitalism. An understanding of this has frequently been obscured by a tendency to caricature Lenin's theory of imperialism to mean the division of the world into political colonies. Since Africa was the classic example of political partition, it would then follow that Africa was the continent in which monopoly was principally interested. Lenin spoke first and foremost about the struggle for economic territory. Imperialist nations sometimes found it impossible and necessary to transform their economic territories into political colonies, so as to reinforce exploitation and protect their capitalist front foreign competition. A great example of this is, like, honestly, Sankara. Like, everything that happens with Sankara basically, like, detaches from the IMF and a lot of the economic hegemonic structure, right? How the IMF would do things is they would force you to open your markets, and in exchange for this, they would sell crops or, some sort of food for a certain cheap amount. But this would also end up kind of weakening their economy, their domestic economy, because they're just importing a shit ton of food for a very low price. And it also, at that same time, did not fix the issues on the ground of these states, right? Which is why Sankara, instead of just, asking for food, Sankara is like, we want the materials to better produce anything agricultural out of it. And within 2 years, he makes Burkina Faso self-sufficient, and then it's completely undone when he's assassinated like a year or two later. As Lenin put it, colonial possessions alone gives complete guarantee of success to the monopolies against all risks of struggle with competitors, including the risk that the latter will defend themselves by means of a law establishing a state monopoly. Nevertheless, monopoly capital often settled for spheres of economic interest which retained varying degrees of political independence. Monopoly capital had a small representation on the African continent relative to its presence in Asia and America, but appeared in sufficient force to precipitate the ruthless scramble for Africa. It must be borne in mind that such capital as was invested in Africa was concentrated in 2 key areas, South Africa and Egypt, with the Congo, Maghreb, and Nigeria as other decisive points. Looking at East Africa, one bourgeois historian, Kelbner, remarked that, quote, the Imperial British East African Company was certainly not a galaxy of big capitalist interests, end quote. This was meant as a neat aside which would put down the Leninist interpretation, and it is actually factually accurate throughout threw woefully out of focus. Lenin's position did not imply that every part of Africa was bulging with surplus capital brought in by big European monopolies. It is not necessary, for example, to seek a specific reason why Europeans wanted the region that is now the Central African Republic. It is enough to know that monopoly capital was interested in a few parts of the continent where potential was, to some extent, verified. In squabbling for those areas, Europeans also saw fit to apportion among themselves the great unknown expanses, especially since nobody wanted to miss a share, not even Spain or Italy. The main elements of the epoch of Cecil Rhodes in southern Africa are too well known to require attention here. All the ingredients about which Lenin spoke were clearly present. There were Rhodes and De Beers representing monopoly capital. There were gold and diamonds and the possibility of extensive railroad development. There was Anglo-German competition, and there was the spectacle of both the Boers and the Africans being subjected to and incorporated into the far-flung empire of capital. The Egyptian scene is equally well known, the Suez Canal being symbolic of the great ambitions of European finance capital. Disraeli was nothing but a frontman for the Rothschilds, who later utilized their political influence to bring about the conquest of Egypt. Besides, British capitalists interested in India had good reason for wanting to oust the French and colonize Egypt and the Sudan. In Egypt, Britain, and France invested capital directly in the canal and indirectly in other sectors through loans. The French were very keen on loan capital, as Lenin observed when he said that, quote, French imperialism might be termed usury imperialism, end quote. This is well exemplified in the Maghreb. French occupation of Tunisia was achieved through a policy of financial loans at extravagant rates to an equally extravagant Bey of Tainus, who still existed in the feudal atmosphere of the Crusades and who proved easy prey for the manipulations of European financiers. Britain and Italy were also on the deal, but France shut them out by an armed attack on Tunis in 1881, expressively termed a coup de bourse. The Sultan of Morocco was caught in the same bag when in 1904 he negotiated a loan of 62.5 million francs from French banks, pledging 60% of the nation's custom revenue as security. Algeria was an exception, though not a very important one from an analytic viewpoint. Its coastlands had fallen prey to French greed since 1830, and so the beginning of its colonization was not part of the general imperialist expansion. However, from the 1880s, interest in Algeria was stimulated by France's new offensive in Africa, and the Maghreb in particular. When Lenin referred to Portugal as a British colony, he indicated this was true long before the heyday of imperialism, but that it assumed new significance in the epoch of partition. His remarks in that context are quite appropriate to the Algerian-French relationship. Relations of this kind, said Lenin, have always existed between big and little states, but during the period of capitalist imperialism, they become a general system. They form parts of the process of dividing the world. They become a link in the chain of operations of world finance capital. In Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, military force was applied in the interest of finance as well as to keep the Mediterranean plains free for European settlers. This question of finding room for Europe's surplus population was one to which Lenin gave prominence, taking his cue from the pronouncements of imperialists like Cecil Rhodes. In practice, it was not an important theme in the imperialist takeover of the African continent, the Maghreb being one of the few areas where it was applicable. South of the Sahara and north of the Transvaal, Transvaal is like the Boers. Like, think of this is basically like old Dutch colony in South Africa, predating the presence of British South Africa, lies the vast mass of Black Africa, which was so blithely cut up by the robber statesmen who sat together in Berlin in 1884. This is referencing the scramble for Africa. Setting apart Egypt and South Africa as exceptional capital-receiving countries in 19th century Africa cleared the way for mystifying the partition of the rest of the continent by talking about explorers and missionaries bringing civilization to the natives. Yet, in some ways, it can be said that nowhere is the universality of the Leninist formulation better vindicated than in these lands where capitalism had previously unleashed slave trading from the east and west coasts. Under the old capitalism, when free competition prevailed, the export of goods was the most typical feature, said Lenin. Under modern capitalism, when monopolies prevail, the export of capital has become the typical feature. A glance at the evidence would show that this changeover was sharply affected in tropical Africa. During the epoch of the slave trade, Europeans carried goods to Africa and exchanged them for human beings, who were thus transformed into saleable commodities. When Europe became interested in the raw materials of the continent, capital was sent to transform Africans into workers and peasants producing for the capitalist market. The Congo has the unfortunate distinction of being one of the first as well as one of the last African countries in which slaving took place. By the 19th century, someone living in the Congo Basin could be seized and sent westward to the Atlantic or eastward to the Indian Ocean. Imperialist Europe had to stamp out the slave trade where it still survived. The new necessity was for African labor to be harnessed by European capital so as to export raw materials like rubber and cotton. Enter Livingstone, Stanley, and King Leopold, backed by the Belgian franc and white missionaries who preached the redeeming value of work, which produced what capitalism required. It is a mere illusion to present the Congo as the property of one man, King Leopold, basically the King of Belgium, and to discuss its colonization in terms of personal fancy. It was because several nations were bent on exploiting the Congo that it was left under the nominal administration of the ruler of a small state. Britain was itself interested only in a guarantee of trade and not in sovereignty over the country. Britain first tried for a treaty with Portugal, which would have given the Congo to the Portuguese while allowing British merchants to enjoy extensive privileges. Later, Britain fell in line with France and Germany in support of Leopold's creation of a Congo free state. Free in the sense that there should be no restrictions on trade and investment by capitalists of all countries. There was a great humanitarian outcry against the atrocities committed by Europeans in the Congo under Leopold's regime. But the International Commission, which studied the situation, was more interested in the fact that Leopold had violated the agreements on free trade. In 1906, as Leopold's personal rule drew to an end, he felt obliged to offer 4 huge concessions to the British, French, and American capitalists. That was the point at which Union Minière and Fourmière came into being, and the Congo took the first step towards being the cockpit of international monopoly capital. The Congo was atypical. Elsewhere in Africa, the principal European capitalist nations seized economic territory and ran up their own flags to prove the point. Sometimes the flagpoles seem to have been struck into the ground without rhyme or reason. Why little Gambia inside Senegal's belly? Why German Togo and French Dahomey closeted between the British colonies of Gold Coast and Nigeria? The only explanation, and one highlighted by Lenin, is the European search for raw materials, particularly for edible oils and fats which were attainable in West Africa from the oil palm and the peanut. It was in order to maintain investments which encouraged the growing of peanuts that British capitalists clung to Gambia, while Togo and Dahomey were protectorates established by Germany and France to protect their interests in palm oil. The German involvement in the palm oil trade and its acquisition of Togo constitute a small episode which illumines one of Lenin's principal arguments concerning the way that Germany was fast outstripping Britain and France in the phase of monopoly capital. Germany had a major interest in the West African oil palm because its expanding industries and railways had need for more lubricants. Its proletariat offered a large market for cheap cooking oils. Its advanced mixed farming sector utilized palm kernel cake as stock feed. Its steamships had established direct lines with West and East Africa, and Hamburg was the only place in Europe with the machinery for crushing palm kernels, basically northern Germany. The consequence of all this was that Germany received a much larger share of the economic territory of West Africa than is apparent, by encroaching into territory politically controlled by Britain and France. By 1885, German firms, backed by the Disconto Bank, had secured over half the palm kernel exports of the British Protectorate of Lagos, and one-third of the palm oil. More than 3/4 of the palm kernels exported from British West Africa went to Germany up to 1914. Besides, the acquisition of the small colony of Togo and the other German colonies was a notable achievement in that German economic power had to overcome the long historical head start established by Britain and France, whose presence in West Africa dated from the period of the slave trade. Not all companies engaged in palm oil trade were monopoly concerns. On the contrary, the commerce got underway in the early 19th century with a large number of small entrepreneurs who were known as palm oil ruffians, and whose activities constituted a phase of violent free enterprise. But by the time of the partition, the Niger Riser had a single giant firm, the Royal Niger Chartered Company, and it was the first colonial government of northern Nigeria, just as Rhodes' more notorious British South African Company was entrusted with the destiny of South Africa's people. The way that the RNCC subsumed and consumed competitors by mergers, cut prices, and other means fits neatly into the classic pattern analyzed by Lenin. Its charter, granted in 1886, ended in 1897, but it continued as the Niger Company until 1911. This is from Walter Rodney. He made a fantastic book on this. What is it? Yes, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Yes, that's it. Highly recommend. A large part of Nigerian production was therefore destined to fall under the control of the African capitalist octopus, the United Africa Company, which in turn was a subsidiary of Anglo-Dutch Unilever. Lenin had spoken of monopoly in the sense of the dominance of one or two firms within a particular branch of industry in a given capitalist economy. In the economic partition and repartition of Africa, new dimensions of monopoly appeared. Firstly, some European firms established dominance over colonial trade, a much more diffuse category than, say, the steel, oil, or chemical industries which were the objects of Lenin's attention. Thus, the UAC, the United African Company, appeared in all British colonies and in the Congo, Dahomey, Upper Volta, Chad, and the Carnations, handling whatever raw materials happened to be the staple in those territories. Secondly, the UAC in most cases extended its tentacles over all facets of given colonial economy, from shipping to the distribution of razor blades in its own retail shops. Similarly, French colonial monopolies such as the CFAO, SCOA, and Madagascar Import-Export were actively engaged in concessionaire agricultural activity as well as handling most of the imports and exports. No monopoly, however great, could have such complete control over a metropolitan capitalist economy. It must be reiterated that Lenin had little to say that was explicitly concerned with Africa. From that it follows that while his insights provide an immediate point of departure for an analysis of the imperialist partition of Africa, one should not expect to find all the answers in his writings. For that matter, Lenin did not pose a very significant question. Why did imperialism appear in Africa in the form of political partition? This omission is one reason why bourgeois writers have got away with blurring the distinction between imperialism and the political partition of Africa. The two things are not interchangeable. Imperialism derived from the expansion of the capitalist economy, while partition was determined by A, the nature of African social formations, B, the element of racism within the capitalist superstructure, and C, the opposition of Africans to European incursion. In some cases, imperialism was prepared to allow countries their political independence, as in Latin America and the Balkans, while in others, European intervention and tax collection and the setting up of spheres of commercial interest, such as in China, gravely impaired political independence, but did not abolish it altogether. In Latin America and Eastern Europe, there were social classes which were playing a role within capitalist production long before the imperialist epoch. These countries were easily incorporated by imperialism, provided that nothing was done to openly deprive them of the attributes of national sovereignty, for they had a bourgeoisie which had participated in national revolutions. In 19th century China, there existed a bureaucratic feudal class and the beginnings of a national bourgeoisie, both of which could be used as instruments of foreign capital. The bureaucratic feudalists, in particular, were rapidly transformed into compradors serving imperialism. Most of Africa in this period was pre-feudal in its social relations, and Europeans therefore found it necessary to introduce their own personnel and to set up their own governments. However, there were a few Africans with the necessary social experience who could have functioned independently within the colonial framework. In Senegal, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and Nigeria, an African educated elite was in the process of formation ever since the end of this 18th century, and was quite prominent by the time the colonial government was instituted. The take about partition? What do you mean? About the characteristics of the political partition? Do you say partition of the world along imperialist states had more? You are misreading, because this is about capital as a whole, right? But he's saying that, like, obviously racism was a contributor to it, right? It enabled it, right? Imperialism derived from the expansion of the capitalist economy, while partition was determined by A, the nature of the African social formations, B, the element of racism within the capitalist superstructure, and C, the opposition of Africans to European incursion. Yeah, like, he's making a distinction between imperialism generally and the partition of Africa. But the ways that he's pointing to it is actually accurate. In fact, the China example is a fantastic one for understanding what it is, because China did have a semblance of, independence, but there were essentially like a lot of imperialist powers who were circling them, where if anything that was not approved happened, they would step in. And a great example of this is actually the Sino-Japanese War in the early 1900s, where basically Japan goes to take over some sections of China, and the Western powers are basically like, no, you can't do that. And then they make guidelines for what parts Japan can take, And then the parts that they separated from Japan, they just took themselves. The coming of colonialism involved the deliberate destruction of this black elite because of the racism spawned in the earlier phase of capitalist expansion, when genocide in Latin America and the enslavement of Africans had to be given pseudoscientific and obscurantist philosophical justification. South Africa was another laboratory in which the white racist virus was cultivated. I love this. And while capitalism subordinated the quasi-feudal economy of the Boers, it was found useful to further entrench racism as a prop to the brutal exploitation of the labor of the black peoples of southern Africa. As a part of this capitalist superstructure, racism was so powerful that Europeans could scarcely bear the thought of politically independent Ethiopia and Liberia on the African continent, despite the fact that both those states had become enmeshed with the international capitalist system. Africa had no revolutionary nationalist traditions which would have clashed with colonialist ambitions. Nevertheless, there was widespread resistance to the imposition of colonial rule, because people spontaneously defended their way of life against aliens. In one instance, that of Ethiopia, European force was inadequate, and the Ethiopians trounced the Italians at Dogali in 1887, and more decisively at Adowa in 1896, thus guaranteeing their political independence. On the other hand, Britain suffered some setbacks in Egypt and the Sudan, and used those as stepping stones to political power. It is quite true that British statesmen did not envisage political rule over Egypt when British capital was first invested in the Suez Canal. The embryonic Egyptian nationalist movement under Colonel Yorabi and the Sudanese victory over General Hicks and Gordon were undoubtedly events which forced Britain to exercise political domination over Egypt and the Sudan. From the events of Egypt, some bourgeois writers have drawn the mindless conclusion that it was the Egyptian nationalist revolt, rather than finance capital, which explains the presence of British imperialism in that part of Africa. Clearly, the nationalist manifestation was a response to British imperialism, which, with its French counterpart, had already taken possession of Egypt as an economic territory. For Lenin, the division of economic territory was the central factor, and the correctness of that position is powerfully evident today in Africa, when imperialism has completely changed its form of political partition, the better to pursue the substance of economic exploitation. There's another one he did that's fantastic. Fascism at Home and Colonialism Abroad. This is it. Yes, this is the book. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Highly recommend this book. Highly, highly recommend it. It was no ordinary post-war crisis which Western Europe faced in the 1940s and 1950s. The bourgeoisie had to rebuild capitalist states at a time when socialism had already proved itself in the Soviet Union, and in a period when the Red Army of the Soviets had aided groups of socialists to come to power in Eastern Europe. This was the greatest challenge ever to be faced by the bourgeoisie because, unlike fascism, socialism threatened the basic capitalist principle of private ownership of the means of production. Furthermore, socialist principles were making their presence felt even in the remote corners of the colonies, and the capitalists realized the necessity for cutting the colonies off from socialist thought, as well as using colonial resources to starve off what they termed the threat of communism. In the capitalist struggle to keep off the challenges of socialism as a competing mode of production and way of life, Africa played at least two key roles, one being to provide bases for the capitalist militarists, and the other being to provide a wide range of raw materials essential for modern armament industries. The most vital of these raw materials were uranium and other radioactive substances for atomic and later nuclear weapons, including the hydrogen bomb. Almost rivaling uranium in importance was certain rare minerals, like lithium from Rhodesia, needed for the special steels that went into new aircraft rockets, tanks, guns, and bombs. Apart from saving capitalism in times of crisis, the dependencies have always been prolonging the life of capitalism by taking the edge off the internal contradictions and conflicts which were a part of the capitalist system. The principal contradiction within capitalism from the outset was that between the capitalists and the workers, to keep their system going, the capitalists had to constantly step up the rate of exploitation of their workers. At the same time, European workers were gaining increasing mastery over the means of production in the factories and mines, and they were learning to work collectively in big enterprises and within their own trade union structures. If the bourgeoisie continued to deprive them of the major parts of the fruits of their own labor and to oppress them socially and politically, then those two classes were set on a collision path. Ever since the mid-19th century, Marx had predicted class collision would come in the form of revolution in which workers would emerge victorious. The capitalists were terribly afraid of that possibility, knowing full well that they themselves had seized power from the feudal landlord class by means of revolution. However, imperialism introduced a new factor into the situation, one that deferred the confrontation between workers and capitalists in the metropolis. Only in Russia was there a workers' revolution, and Russia was on the fringe of Europe rather than being one of its metropolitan capitalist centers. That very fact highlighted how much capitalism in places like Britain, France, and Germany had been stabilized by exploiting the colonies and other Semite colonies such as Latin America, where states were independent in name only. Surplus from Africa was partly used to offer a few more benefits to European workers and served as a bribe to make the latter less revolutionary. The bribe came in the form of increased wages, better working conditions, and expanded social services. The benefits of colonialism were diffused throughout European society in many ways. Most capitalist enterprises offered consumer goods which were mass produced at low prices, and therefore the European housewife got some relief. For instance, instant coffee brought that beverage within the reach of the ordinary worker. Meanwhile, the capitalist still made his fortune by ensuring that the Ivory Coast or Colombian grower got no price increase. In that way, colonialism was serving all classes and sectors of Western Europe and other capitalist metropoles. Yeah, Gramsci vindicated. Gramsci vindicated 50 years later. European workers have paid a great price for the few material benefits which accrued to them as crumbs from the colonial table. The class in power controls the dissemination of information. The capitalists misinformed and miseducated workers in the metropoles to the point where they became allies in colonial exploitation. In accepting to be led like sheep, European workers were perpetuating their own enslavement to the capitalists. They ceased to seek political power and contented themselves with bargaining for small wage increases, which are usually counterbalanced by increased costs of living. They ceased to be creative and allowed bourgeois cultural decadence to overtake them all. They failed to exercise any independent judgment on the great issues of war and peace, and therefore ended up by slaughtering not only colonial peoples, but also themselves. Fascism was a monster born of capitalist parents. Fascism came as the end product of centuries of capitalist bestiality, exploitation, domination, and racism, mainly exercised outside Europe. It is highly significant that many settlers and colonial officials displayed a leaning towards fascism. Apartheid in South Africa is nothing but fascism. It was gaining roots from the early period of white colonization in the 17th century, and particularly after the mining industry brought South Africa fully into the capitalist orbit in the 19th century. Another example of fascist potential of colonialism was seen when France was overrun by Nazi Germany in 1940. The French fascists collaborated with Hitler to establish what was called the Vichy regime in France, and the French white settlers in Africa supported the Vichy regime. A more striking instance to the same effect was the fascist ideology developed by the white settlers in Algeria, who not only opposed independence for Algeria under Algerian rule, but they also strove to bring down the more progressive or liberal governments of metropolitan France. Inside Europe itself, some specific and highly revealing connections can be found between colonialist behavior and the destruction of the few contributions made by capitalism to human development. For instance, when Colonel von Lettow returned from leading the German forces in East Africa in World War I, he was promoted to a general in the German army, and von Lettow was in command of the massacre of German communists in Hamburg in 1918. That was a decisive turning point in German history, for once the most progressive workers had been crushed, the path was clear for the fascist deformation of the future. In brutally suppressing the Maji-Maji War in Tanganyika and attempting genocide against the Herero people of Namibia, Southwest Africa, the German ruling class were getting the experience which they later applied against the Jews and against German workers and progressives. When the fascist dictatorship was inaugurated in Portugal, this is a banger comparison, by the way. When the fascist dictatorship was inaugurated in Portugal in 1926, it drew inspiration from Portugal's colonial past. After Salazar became the dictator in 1932, he stated that his new state in Portugal would be based on the labor of the inferior peoples, meaning, of course, Africans. In addition, Portuguese peasants and workers had to submit to police terror, poverty, and dehumanization, so they paid and are still paying a high price for fascism at home and colonialism abroad. Colonialism strengthened the Western European ruling class and capitalism as a whole. Particularly in its later phases, it was evidently giving a new lease of life to a mode of production that was otherwise dying. For every viewpoint other than that of the minority class of capitalists, colonialism was a monstrous institution holding back the liberation of man. Banger. Fire writing emoji. I cannot stress enough. Please read this shit. How Europe underdeveloped Africa. It's a fucking banger. Please read it. I'm begging you. I'm begging you.